Hey everybody, this is Stephanie Glickman, the Clinical Director at the Family Center Treatment Foundation, and I'm joined today by Bill Painter, who is the chair of our development team at the Family Center Treatment Foundation, part of our board of directors. And we're going to be talking about the therapeutic apology. And so, Bill, if you could start off, just share with us a little bit about what is the therapeutic apology and how do we begin to initiate it into the treatment process with FCT families?
I was working with kids in residential programming that had parental rights terminated, but their behaviors were so extreme that they were in treatment. And so one of the in residential treatment, and one of the underlying factors I discovered as a therapist was this combination of desire, regardless of what their parent had done, to be with them or to connect with them or to experience some kind of relationship with them, affection, that would often drive them to sabotage other placements. It would be their once they were able to put it together in wording, and had safety to talk about it, no matter how great other placements were, that compulsion to try to get back home and get those answers or get back in that relationship with the person they felt like they had lost was significant. And then the other side of that was this feeling of somehow not knowing, somehow feeling responsible as a child for what had happened, either for not protecting or taking care of the parent, or that I brought this on myself. No matter what they had been told by therapists, the takeaway was either overtly what people had, the parent or caregiver had said to them or made them feel like they were bad, or inadvertently they, in their effort to try to make sense of the world, had to kind of internalize that somehow I'm responsible. So when I was trying to hunt up birth parents that had even had parental rights terminated, and many hadn't, but many of them had, in the situation of those kids that had many placements, of course with court permission, and not for the purpose of reunification, but for the purpose of just a therapeutic session that eventually I want them to be able to have with their child, to free them up, to give them permission to move on. That was my original thinking, was you can give your child permission to move on, and letting them know that wanted them to have a good life. But it was deeper than that. I discovered that it was more than that they needed to do. And through that, how to engage that parent that maybe was feeling like the system had done them wrong significantly, or that was still in denial, or was, for whatever reasons, not involved in any kind of helping process. I had to be able to join with them by acknowledging that somehow they had given their child something wonderful, because the child was still so much wanting to be with them or in love with them, or just sabotaging other placements to get back to them. And the words I would use really depended upon what the child's history, but ultimately the underlying way of trying to join with that parent that couldn't parent again, or was never going to be able to parent, but physically, was just to acknowledge you this is so big that your child is compelled to get back with you, or wants you so badly, or still madly, aligned with you. So finding words in their vernacular that would work, just to how I approach them, just to a very tender, caring, non-judgmental way, and begin to let their guard down. Um, and so I happen to believe that uh, you know, even if you're not able to bring them home to live with you right now, or you don't have a stable place, sometimes those would be people on the street, homeless. Um, Sometimes they had been running from the law, from place to place to place, and however miraculously are connected with. Um, Sometimes traveling many, many miles, get like to Washington D.C. on the streets, and then being able to just say, I believe you have the power to help your child um, make sense of the world and feel good about themselves better than anyone else in the world can. So trying to first affirm them and then relabel and reframe that they have some power to. And I would often say it. The part of parenting you can do here, you can parent still. You may not be in a position to physically take care of them day by day and all the daily living tasks. But I'll kind of discussion with them about where they were, what they wanted, and just be able to reflect it back and say, so you're not there yet, but there's something you can do that no one else can do as well as you can from a parenting perspective. So that would often intrigue them, and say, so you have the power to let your child know that they're okay, that they didn't originate or cause this spiral, this circle of going from place to place to place. They are okay. That um, they, whatever they feel as a result of this is okay. So being able to very carefully, tenderly map that out for that caregiver, that parent that's no longer ever, probably ever going to be able to. Maybe they're still addicted to drugs. Maybe they're still in prostitution. This kind of things, or still in Hell's Angels, whatever it was back then. They were able to. I said, so could you say to your child something that set them free? Would you be willing to do that? And then, that was often triggering words because I was affirming them, saying, there's a part of parenting here that no one else can ever do like you. No one will ever have, no matter who tries to do it, they'll never be able to do this part as well as you. So building on that um, idea that it's true, whoever is the most significant to you in your life, their words become the most meaningful. And so for these children that were in residential, the person that was still the most significant to them in their life, even if they hadn't been with them for a long time, their words to help the child heal would be the most meaningful of anyone. So we would role play it, and I made many, many mistakes because I'd often say, okay, let me come back and bring the child or something like that. And then, of course, they would disappear. I couldn't find them because their own trauma was triggered by just even that conversation. And then one, they would hide, react by flight, running away. And so eventually I learned, and I had a little pocket recorder with a little tiny cassette that this was before iPhones. Can you leave a message here that I can share with your child after we talked about it? And their ability to say essentially what I practiced with them behind the scenes to say that made sense to them. They could believe in it because I'd often connected their history, not doing a full family life cycle timeline, but enough hearing their story enough that I could say, so nobody ever did this for you. Would you be willing to do this for your child? And eventually getting in where I was smart enough to put it on set and then play that for their child or have them write a letter to give their child that said, I want you to know something. This is on us. I should have never had you in that kind of situation, or should have never done these things to you, or whatever I was able to coach them to be able to do, and whatever specifically was the history, and then to be able to say, it's not your fault. then the third tangent of that apology was, it's okay if you love me still, or if you are angry with me, and you never have to forgive me. Acknowledging that even the unspoken feelings the child might have, or even the feelings they may not be aware, they are not aware of, they're giving them permission for all those feelings, saying, I don't want you to handle these feelings in ways that you trouble or mess up. And that's when you have this opportunity, whatever. So that was kind of the origins of it. And through the years, the understanding of how to apply it to various situations and deeper recognition of how this is trauma treatment came later.
Where in the model do you think that this has the most impact when you're working with families? Like what phase of treatment?
I would say in our model, depends. If you're finding that in restructuring where you're working on eco-structural things that are just trying, particularly from a child welfare referral, trying to help them through things that might historically be considered traditional social work, just and parent teaching around schedules, rewards, consequences, words to use, being able to emotionally remove yourself from conflict with your child, depending on the scenario. In all that restructuring process, there's a lot of eco-structural things happen. But when even the parent is trying to do all of that beautifully, and they're doing that constant balance of nurturing and structuring, and yet the reaction from the child is still resentment or bitterness or vulnerability, then you can build it into, you can say there's something else going on here, that in the way that they're being able to accept your all these changes you've made. So a practical scenario or a practical experience that I remember very well was a mother in Maryland who had, through a series of events of her own life, through domestic violence, substance abuse, her own life was such, she had no clue how, and then she was addicted and involved in substance abuse and in relationships where she was abused by people she was with. She lost her child at about 5 years old, a girl, and so the little girl was placed in foster homes. She was, had been so accustomed to taking control and being that adult in her own life that she was like so difficult to handle and rage filled and all this kind of stuff because she wanted back with her mama. She loved her mama more than the world. And then she was removed from foster home to foster home to foster home because her behaviors were so bad. Eventually ended up in residential treatment. Got involved by the time she was 12 and 13 in juvenile justice situations where she became part of DGS there in Maryland. Simultaneously, her mother was getting it together and was involved in substance abuse treatment, was able to complete her degree, got a good job, got good housing, and was able to work towards getting her child back. And the Department of Social Services placed her back home, I think right at 13 years old, maybe a little bit before. And we were working with the mother and doing all the structural things, to help her with parenting techniques that she never had, were taught or been aware of, and how to balance that nurturing process and that structuring process. And so a lot of the eco-structural things that were really, really beautiful. She was doing a great job. And the 13-year-old was was still hell on wheels, still listening, and even sometimes would be extremely ugly and mean to her mother and screaming, "You bitch, you don't have a right to tell me what to do. You weren't there all these years. Who do you think you are? Can walk in and be my boss when you never were there?" And so there was obviously coming out with rage, and the mother was uh, hurt and very apologetic, but vulnerable. And then sometimes the mother would try to be nurturing and caring and affirmative, and affectionate. And there's like, oh, you think you can be all lovey-dovey now after all these years when you never were there for me. So no matter what she did, she was rejected. So that's where we coached the mother to do this. At that time we didn't know it was a restructuring phase or just more what happens here. And so she was able to very specifically and descriptively apologize and say, when this happened, when you were 3 years old and I was passed out on the sofa and you were shaking me and wanting something to eat and had to go try to find some cereal and milk for yourself, I want you to know that's on me. That should have never happened. That's my fault. And so she discussed or shared from a roles related process of area family functioning is how I describe it now. She was messaging her child. It wasn't a discussion. It wasn't a session. She was stepping into that role to help her child make sense of the world and give her some information about her past. And so being able to very specifically acknowledge every single episode that she as a mother was aware of that her daughter may be resenting her over, that she thought her daughter knew about, but based on some of the things her daughter had said. So being very specific and descriptive, she apologized for reaching in, and every, the 13-year-old should every once in a while, well, what about this? And the mother role played with her ahead of time. She brings up something you don't even know about. You don't get into defensiveness or arguing or saying, I don't remember that. You just say, and that. Because this is not about trying to prove who's right. This is about her perspective. And even if she's being manipulative, you're just trying to remove some of that resentment. So what connected with her, I said, does it feel something like at times that she's literally beating you over the head with some kind of stick or ball bat for everything, for punishing you for everything that's happened in the past? She said, exactly. So I said, you want to be able to remove that, not through a fight, but through say, okay, I deserve this. I deserve all this. So that led to being able to teach her just to role play with her, practice with her, to identify every single thing she was aware of that her daughter might be aware of as well. And even if the daughter brought up things that the mother wasn't aware of, just to say in that too. The second part of that was then to get her to say, you don't ever have to forgive me, and you can hate me or you can love me. Whatever you're feeling is perfectly okay. This is not your fault. That's the third part. The second part is, this is not your fault. You couldn't fix me. You weren't responsible for taking care of me. You didn't make it happen. Being very explicit with that explanation, and then whatever you feel is okay. You don't ever have to forgive me. So walking through all of that was very powerful. And then she was able to say, but you look at all this trouble you've got in for what you have a right to feel. Her makes sense that you feel all these things and that you don't know what to do with them. So they're going to come out. I want us to learn how to handle these feelings. I want you to learn these feelings, so handle them in ways that don't mess up your life, because you don't deserve more problems or being labeled or more trouble or consequences. So that was one of the first really powerful ones we did with FC10. And the daughter didn't, immediately lay down the ball bat. Very quickly she did it. Like, it let the air out of all of her resentment, because it's like figuratively, like the mother just took the bat and said, I'm taking this, I deserve it. And so the daughter had nothing to hold over her head anymore. And so by the time they did their giving back project, they were able to talk about going to runway shelter for kids were into domestic violence situations, speaking to them about their experience. But that was kind of helped me begin to formulate it. And then when I was reading through all this about trauma, it all connected very, very, very strongly that the complex trauma treatment components, this was like the baseline to get into those treatment components. So safety has to be first, and being able to have that create a physical safety obviously is very important, and being able to create that emotional safety followed, and then being able to recognize that some of the behaviors that the daughter was exhibiting were coping mechanisms that were perfectly normal. Often ended up with, historically, as we know, ended up with diagnoses that would be behavioral disorders, or oppositional defiant, or even ADHD kinds of things, and they're really just PTSD. So that's where the merging of the complex trauma treatment needs for those coping mechanisms that are being exhibited through those 6 different arenas of complex trauma merge with the ability of that parent in a very strong roles perspective to from the area of family function, to be able to give them some messaging that lays the baseline for further healing. So that's kind of where the concept comes from, and it then can be looked at from the scenario of the parent that was abusive. I need to say the parent that was neglectful. What did they need to say? And then what is the parent that was in a domestic violence situation or something similar? It's also what do they need to say from the apology proceeding, without taking ownership for what happened to them, for taking ownership for, as a parent, you should have never been in that situation. And I can't blame that on them. I always have a responsibility for it. And then that foster or adoptive or kinship parent being able to take responsibility for as adults that you didn't cause this to happen, and that whole discussion around you don't have to make me want to, parents can remove the burden, and then giving the permission to not or happy or appreciative for being there. So those are the 4 scenarios that I've seen it all affected in. In order to answer your question, when does this happen? I think it happens in restructuring when there's an emotions blockage, and I think if it's not if it hasn't happened during restructuring, then the supervisor needs to be bringing up what are we doing around trauma treatment and value changes. Where are we with that? Have we dealt with some of the underlying issues that if you don't deal with these as a clinician, as a practitioner, you're fearful that going to come out of other ways. So that's where I see it happening most of the time, is in restructuring or in value changes.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I was thinking as you were talking, I was like, this just sounds so in line with emotional blocks and striving for that, creating ownership, and really helping the caregivers to identify what the blocks are, where they're existing. And so what advice would you give to FCT practitioners, as they've been doing the work with the family and the caregiver? What are some key things you might look for to identify this caregiver or the family system is ready for the therapeutic apology to be brought into the treatment process?
I would kind of reframe it, Stephanie, in the sense that when there's not any movement because of the emotions blockage, they may not be ready, but we don't have a choice. What are we going to do except for bring up the fact that there's an emotional blockage, either on the part of the parent or caregiver, or on the part of the child, so or other family members. So we have to ask questions. We have to listen, then you have to explain, and you have to get how to engage them in a role play of doing this therapeutic psychology and relations. So it's rarely that I'm on a call where there's not a need to do this at some level. And so if you're running into that and you're not seeing movement in restructuring, you've got movement up to a certain and maybe they're doing all the structural things, but there's no real evidence that the effective responsiveness needs are happening, their effective involvement needs are happening, or even the behavioral control or problem skills needed that you're teaching them aren't working. So if we're depending on the area of family functioning, that seems the priority. If we're trying to work with around effective and but it ends up being still very much of a round robin process where there's so much defensiveness or resentment in it that there's no real movement or effective involvement, that there's this resistance or hiding, flight or fight kind of approach to effective involvement that keeps coming up. Or the problem solving, there's no real cooperation to problem solve, or even behavioral control when they're trying to coach them and teach them how to, with the individual, how to regulate their behaviors, but also as a system to co-regulate and help each other co-regulate by some effective, I don't want to say interventions as much as just cues or diversions or support at critical times proactively. So if you're finding all this teaching from the restructuring process keeps running into a blockage of some sort, it's hard to identify it, and there's something else going on here. So actually yesterday I was on a clinical consult, and I do think maybe it was with SCAN, and the obvious situation that was occurring was that there was no real, they were evaluating our changes according to the clinician and the practitioner, everybody involved, but there was, it still looked like the ability to be involved together and create that sense of family wasn't there, even from the map and from what was happening. And the practitioner had some real fears that the emotional issues of the mother were still going to be right all the time, and so that created an opportunity for some discussion around what did you discover from this mother's family life cycle and timeline that you could try to make some sense of with her. That would it have been any, you're doing so much better now and you have this really good understanding, but could you have gotten here earlier if someone that you had let you know it was their fault, not you, and give you permission for your feelings? So being able to practice and role play that can kind of be the way of getting into it when there may not be on the surface recipe, but you want to connect it with their own history. And could it have made a difference for you if someone had said to you, you're okay, and make this happen? What do you feel is okay? And how could you have handled your feelings differently? So depending on what you know from family life cycle, you want to be able to hold that mirror up and get into it. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but I think it's not so much us waiting for they're ready, because they may never be ready. One of the clinicians on one of the calls, this was a Massachusetts call, that on the interns said classes, and then she heard it later on NPR. Every child is looking, and so this was in wrapping up the clinical consult and getting feedback from everyone. She said, it reminds me of something I just heard, that every child is looking for their parents to apologize, and every parent's looking for their child to say thank you. So we all have things that we've been hurt by, from our childhood. And so the problem here is that no parent is necessarily ready to apologize. Defining this as an apology of strength, you have the power to give something nobody else can do, so really significant. One of the things this reminds me of, and I want to listen to what you're thinking, Stephanie, and see if this is accomplishing what your intent today was. But with one way to engage them in being able to do this, if they seem to be resistant and they don't seem to be ready, and they're just trying to project blame and say, well, this child, is just bad, or they don't want to listen, or they just want their own way. That's not unusual for practitioners to hear this. There's nothing else going on here. They just want their own way. They just get mad. They're going to resist. They're going to fight if they don't get their way. And this could be a child in his own family of origin, or a child we're working with towards reunification, or it could be a child that's in foster care, or kinship care, or adoption. That those are the situations where the caregiver is just saying to the practitioner, I'm doing all the things you tell me to do. It's not working, and this child wants their own way. They're going to resist me around everything. So I think an easy way to be able to help them step outside their box of looking this or lens of seeing this child as the bad person, to be able to say, so does this seem that the reactions to you when you're giving them a no, or you're giving them a chore to do, daily living, just normal daily living stuff, get this disproportionate reaction. So like, where did this come from? How in the world did this happen? I just asked you to do such and such, and this doesn't make sense to me. So just even asking that caregiver, regardless of what type of caregiver they are, does this seem disproportionate? Does this seem like no matter what you do, you don't know where these reactions are coming from? And to be able to, hopefully, for them to say, yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me. And it's not unusual for some caregivers to respond back and say, well, I went through all this. I had a hard life too. And I didn't act this way. I'm not acting this way. So being able to hold that, in your mind and say, okay, I want to come back to that. So you're telling me that their reaction seems disproportionate to what's happening in the present. And yeah. So maybe that's telling you it's not about the present. Maybe it's telling us that something else is going on here. It's not just about the present, and their reaction is so extreme to just normal day living stuff. And then, so opening the door for them to think about it that way. And then also asking the question, do you think they would be acting this way no matter who they would be with? Because if they've already projected the blame on them and saying they're just a bad kid, or they're problematic, or et cetera, then saying, so do you think they would be acting this way no matter who it was that was giving them this direction or this expectation or saying no to them? And if they was answering and saying, yeah, I think they would be doing this no matter who they were with, then it gives us a chance to say, so it's not about you then. Or just don't take this personally. It's about something then there, and something that's hurting so badly. And if we think about all the behavior is one way of letting us know a need that's not getting met, or a feeling this is how it's coming out. And that often begins to open the doorway for that parent or caregiver that's not ready to begin to think in terms of, okay, well, what are we going to do? There's something else going on here, and just the strict behavior management kind of process, or parent teaching things, they're not working, then we know we're dealing with do differently before we deal with the behavior. Let's try to deal with the underlying behavior. So then those 4 different scenarios come into play depending on the situation. How do you make them know that they didn't start this trajectory? They didn't choose who they were born to. They didn't choose their life. That kind of is a good lead into the apology.
Yeah, it's all such valuable information, and I'm really taking away it's the key to kind of unlock the path into valuing change. You know, it's that emotional block that oftentimes, like you said, it's the barrier that's in the way from keeping the family moving forward. It's that stuck point, and the teams being able to hear that. So when their teammates are presenting families in the MIGS staffings during team meetings, to look for those cues of, oh, I'm hearing, you know, that this might be a block, or I'm hearing they're, you know, a family being unwilling or resistant to try this new thing, or, you know, it really helps to formulate some different ways of thinking about how team members can help their teammates when they're staffing cases, and really getting that trick to, not a trick, but that final key to unlock valuing changes. And it's such a true core, genuine level to get the families to help them, you know, get to that deeper trauma and move them forward. So I very much appreciate your time today and sharing the information about the therapeutic apology. We hope to hear more about it. We want to continue integrating it into the model and helping practitioners just practice role playing and getting more comfortable and familiar with it. And as always, Bill, thank you for your time and your wisdom.